Getting back to the business side a little bit, Mark, you've referenced a couple of times collective bargaining agreement. Tell us a little bit about, I guess, what a collective bargaining agreement is, a little bit of how it currently works within your sport and how it affects your business decisions.
Well, the collective bargaining agreement is basically the agreement between the players' union, and the players have probably one of the strongest, most well-represented historically unions in organized labor in baseball. Marvin Miller, obviously, with some landmark cases, the Curt Flood free agency case, and negotiated very well, and that's kind of been the platform. Incrementally, the owners have, I think, moved it to a more fair arrangement over time. But it's the basic agreement, and what happens is historically, it tied a large portion of the revenues towards local markets, which obviously were impacted by attendance. And then as sports have evolved and the corporate landscape's become such a large portion of revenue, it shifted a lot of the revenue towards some of the other areas, whether it be media properties, whether it be the corporate opportunities that lie within a ballpark, and suites and signage, all the corporate marketing opportunities. So over time within baseball, the disproportionate revenue streams in big markets and small markets has continued to get broader and broader. And as you've got a different style of executive in some of the big market teams that have been able to exploit those revenue streams, particularly in Boston, and I think the Yankees have reacted to Boston and adjusted to Boston a little bit. Not only have those revenue streams become disproportionate, but how those revenues are deployed has become disproportionate. And so the opportunities for us to find value, to find inefficiencies in the market have gotten smaller and smaller. And the CBA exacerbates those challenges in a small market. Still not impossible. I think the reality of this is that we live within cycles. We've got to look for our opportunities, exploit the opportunities when they exist. Ownership has given us the ability to do that when they exist, and then recognize them when you go into a dip, so that it doesn't become what's happened in Kansas City and Cincinnati and Baltimore and Pittsburgh, where there's no cycle. It's prolonged, downturn. And I think if you're proactive, if you're willing to withstand some of the emotion that you feel by making those tough decisions, if you get an ownership who empowers you to do that, that you can put yourself in a strategic position to get out of that down cycle and get back to winning. And do what we did through, for a 4-year period, and 04 through, 08 arguably, or a 5-year period, and what Tampa Bay did for just a couple years, and Milwaukee did for just a couple years. But you've got to be proactive, you've got to be aggressive, you've got to have an ownership that supports that, empowers that. And in baseball, you've got to recognize that the CBA creates a lot of challenge, and hope that in the next negotiation we again incrementally move it a little more towards recognizing some of the smaller market challenges that exist, and level the playing field with revenue sharing and some other ways of sharing.
And when is baseball's current CBA?
After the 2011 season. That's right, Dan. It's right after yeah.
Right.
Two elements there. They sort of work hand in hand, which is the CBA and then revenue sharing as an added component of that. In our league, we have, with our collective bargaining agreement, which is on a similar, I think all of our sports are sort of in the same cycle, even hockey, the NHL, in terms of when the CBAs expire as they're currently configured. But we have a cap, and then we have a tax. And in our league, the aspect of this is you can exceed the tax line. This tax line is about $69 million. And at that point, it's painful, but you can choose to go into the tax, and for every dollar you spend going into the tax, you are taxed another dollar. And so that figures into the thought process and management certainly around the league. We have an owner in Dan. Last year we had the 3rd highest payroll in the league, so we paid a lot of tax, or Dan paid a lot of tax on that end. But that figures in significantly because ultimately, we work hard, I think, from every perspective. From a revenue generation, and Danny Ferry, our general manager, does a phenomenal job with everything we have going on from a team end, and to that extent, the dollars are invested wisely from that perspective. But it is a impact of our sport in terms of when you go into that tax threshold, which it impacts a significant number of teams, because that tax line and the cap is based on a percentage of revenue. And what's happened as revenues have leveled off, and in certain cases are even descending in certain cases because of the state of the economic affairs out there, you have this interesting scenario happening where the tax line and cap have actually, not, instead of generally going up in this type of 5-7% range, is actually flattened, but you have player contracts that are obligated that are going up, so it tightens the market from that end. Coupled with that is revenue sharing, and our league has what I would say, relatively, doesn't have maybe as, or certainly not as significant of a revenue sharing plan, certainly as the NFL to that extent, but that is a more modest piece of the picture. It's more local revenue generation driven versus how much is shared from an overall league end, which does create, disparity, more disparity with larger markets to smaller markets, or higher revenue teams versus lower revenue teams.
I think before I talk about our collective bargaining agreement, I'll just highlight some of the aspects of our financial model. We have, as I said earlier, a large percentage of our revenues are shared. So our national TV deal and direct TV deal are shared, and that was done by, back in the 60s, in the 50s when, you need two teams to play. So Green Bay, although it's in a very small marketplace, will get the same network TV money as in New York, and that was one of the principles that our league was founded upon. And then when you expand that the way the gate is shared, again, it relieves a lot of the pressure that there is still a gap, and it's growing more and more significant by the day as new stadiums are built. But the gap isn't what it is in the other two sports, but we do have some issues there. We have a competitive draft, so if your team isn't doing that well, you get to pick toward the top, and there's some issues with that system where you have an unproven player that's never played in the NFL and is going to get $40 or $45 million guaranteed. The draft at best is 50-50, so if you're going to put a $45 million bet down at 50-50, I don't know what kind of odds we can get from Len over there, but to me it doesn't sound too risk averse. But and then again, as you get into the collective bargaining agreement piece of it, right now we have a salary cap in place for this year. It's about $123 million per club, so $123 million. In addition, there's another about $25 million in player benefits that are allocated out there. So the teams, on average, team payroll and player costs is about $150 million. As we look into next year, currently next year is going to be an uncapped year. And so there'll be football, but it'll be not with a cap system, and that's the way it's set up right now. So what does that mean? What that means is that teams can spend as much or they can spend as little as they want next year on player salaries. In addition, player benefits get chopped not quite in half, but instead of players getting $25 million in benefits, maybe they'll get about $14 million. So there's kind of a disincentive for them to not want to continue the cap as well. There's some other things in there that was designed to kind of discourage getting to the uncapped year. Players who would normally be free agents after 4 years, they're now free agents after 6 years. So they're not going to be free. They'll be restricted, but there isn't a lot of movement in the restricted free agency market. So when you put all that together, there's an incentive for both sides to kind of get a deal done over the next few months. But it's one of those things. The sides are talking. The union has a new leader, DeMaurice Smith. He is a lawyer by trade. He's not very well connected in NFL circles, but he is connected in Washington, D.C. Commissioner Goodell, this will be his first test trying to extend the labor deal. He's been involved in the other ones. So we're kind of set up where we're entering in March, we'll enter into an uncapped year, and then March of 2011, if we don't have a deal by then there's a potential for a work stoppage. So right now we have some uncertainty there. The good news, there'll be football next year in terms of what that will look like and teams are spending. I think each team is kind of looking at it from where they sit, but that's kind of the state of collective bargaining agreement in the NFL.
I will tell